will be chaired by Professor Simi Malhotra, head of the Department of English at Jamia Millia Islamia, and Farhana Tasneem, who is also a co-organizer of the conference and is also a PhD scholar at the Department of English, Jamia Millia Islamia. Farhana's areas of interest are memory studies and cultural studies. She's pursuing her PhD on the works of Orhan Pamuk, and particularly on the idea of melancholia or huzn that runs through it. The rapporteur for this session will be Zainab Abrar, who's also a PhD scholar at the Department of English. I now pass on the virtual mic to Farhana to introduce our speaker, Professor Sam Durrant. Rana.
Thank you, Sana. It is my utmost privilege to introduce the keynote speaker for our fourth keynote session, Dr. Sam Durrant. Dr. Sam Durrant is Associate Professor of Postcolonial Literature and Critical Theory at University of Leeds. He is the author of Postcolonial Narrative and the Work of Mourning. He's also the co-editor of numerous publications and postcolonial literature and refugee studies. His most recent work in trauma studies is Cosmological Trauma in Postcolonial Literature, co-authored with Ryan Topper for the Routledge Companion to Literature and Trauma 2020. He currently runs a webinar series on animism and is also working on a book which is presently entitled Planetary Identifications, Animism, Mimesis, and Modernity. We are so glad to have you here, Professor Durrant. I would like to introduce the title of his talk, which is Whose Memory Is It Anyway? Animism, Literature, and Disenclosure of Memory and Trauma Studies. The keynote speech will be followed by a brief question and answer session. We will be recording the session, and at the same time, the conference is also being live streamed for our audience on YouTube. So the floor is all yours now, sir. Over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me. Being really thrilled to give this paper. So thank you, Farhana, Sango, Sheikh, and Simi in particular, but also everybody, and in particular whoever was so efficient in uploading the recordings onto YouTube, because I was fretting about my paper yesterday, so I missed Steph's talk, but I was able to catch it after I'd got a bit more confident about my paper. And there's interesting ways in which Steph sort of announces, without knowing it, part of my paper, where I give a reading of the Tancred and Clorinda episode from an animist perspective, which actually is taken from the article that Farhana mentioned on cosmological trauma that I wrote with my ex-PhD student, Ryan Topper. Okay, so let's get going. My style is on these presentations, I think it's quite exhausting sometimes to be online for a whole conference. So I've taken the liberty of most of my points are actually written on the screen as well as articulated. So I won't read my points out, hopefully, but I tend to extemporize from them. But I think that'll make things easy for people to follow. And I think my argument is fairly straightforward anyway, so hopefully, but it'll give you a chance to see the references at the same time. Okay, so you've noticed in my title that I talk about disenclosure. So I thought I'd start by thinking about what disenclosure is. So this is the title. Very much like Michaela's paper, I'm really inspired by the work of Achille Mbembe. And he uses the term disenclosure in his book, Out of the Dark Night, which is his rereading of the anti-colonial project as not really a race-based articulation of difference, but as an anti-racist humanist movement that Mbembe suggests can also be expanded, so it becomes a protest against the enclosures of identity. So very much like Michaela, I don't like my students to talk about identity, which they always want to do. And I think Mbembe is very much an anti-identitarian, someone who is encouraging us to think outside of the ways in which we are structured by external forces and the ways in which we're interpolated by different ideological forces. So race for him is an enclosure, as is class, as is gender, as is species as well. So these are all ways in which we enclose the subject, we enclose ourselves as beings on the planet. And the project for him, the decolonial project, if you like, is to explode, if you like, these categories so that we can understand ourselves as living beings on a planet who share all sorts of commonalities. The idea of enclosure obviously comes from, well, not obviously, it comes from a long British tradition of enclosing land. So from the medieval period onwards, the enclosure of land, the creation of land as property, and the evacuation of the human from that property in many cases. So that there's a long Marxist tradition which sees this as the beginning of capitalism, essentially. And that movement, comes right forwards, and we're thinking about that now. I think you've all probably been talking about the idea of the commons in recent times, where we're thinking about how we can recover spaces in common. So literally spaces, like land. But Mbembe takes this, and he doesn't quite metaphorize it, but he thinks about how is it that other ways of being in the world are also enclosed. So for him, identity is an enclosure, like land is an enclosure. It limits us from the open, Heideggerian category of the open, in which we can all, in some sense, share a space as living beings. So he's very much after a kind of horizontal identification between different beings, not only human beings, but also other beings on the planet. So he says the philosophical aim of decolonization and the anti-colonial movement that made it possible can be summed up in one phrase: the disenclosure of the world, la déclosion du monde. What does it mean then to disenclose trauma studies? I think in my title I put trauma and memory studies, but I really am just talking about trauma studies, to be honest. For me, it means thinking about the subject that we presuppose that has been traumatized, the topographical nature of that subject in Freud, and the way in which that subject then presupposes trauma as an intrusion, as an external excitation that somehow gets inside the consciousness system of an individual and then causes trauma, because it's an external foreign body, if you like, that's entered into our consciousness and that has then caused this breach in consciousness. Whereas from the perspective of the planetary, from Achille Mbembe's perspective, the problem is not that we have let something in from outside that we shouldn't have done. The problem is the barrier, the protective shield, as Freud calls it, that insulates us from the external world. It's that insulating barrier, in fact, as I'm going to argue, that is, in fact, the producer of trauma. Rather than that which shields us from trauma, trauma is produced precisely in the move by which the human separates itself off from the world. So that's really my argument. I could stop there, but I'll go on. Okay, so Steph offered a little kind of précis of trauma studies history. I've offered my own here. It's not really a history. It's 4 positions that are roughly historical, but you can see that they're not entirely. So we could start off then with Freud's model of the subject and of trauma. And it's what I would call, and following my colleague, Nicholas Ray, an immunitary model. It's a model in which the subject is constituted as something that needs to defend itself against the outside world. And there's lots of work by people like Roberto Esposito, a biopolitical thinker, who think about what it means for us to constitute ourselves as subjects that somehow need defending against foreign bodies. This has a kind of geopolitical resonance. If we're thinking about, for instance, the war against terror, the ways in which we constitute nations as bordered entities that needed to be defended against foreign bodies, to do with migration and to do with refugee-dom as well. So that's the norm. That's the model that we've been given, and that's the model that psychoanalysis is in some ways lumbered with. It can't quite think outside that odd idea of a bordered psyche, one that needs forms of protection from the outside world. However, the second move, as I see it, it's not quite chronological, but the second move is the move that trauma studies makes when it's instantiated by people like Cathy Carruth, influenced by Derrida, by de Man, and various other people, in which they try to suggest actually what's interesting about trauma studies is precisely this dialectic, if I can put it like that, between inside and outside, the ways in which trauma, in Carruth's words, implicates us in other people's histories and traumas. And I take as exemplary, in a sense, her readings of Hiroshima Mon Amour and Moses and Monotheism as theorizations of the ways in which trauma implicates us in other people's histories. Unlike Steph, who feels that she's too Eurocentric, I feel actually that she presents a position that is precisely placing European trauma in relationship to other traumas. And it's also showing how European history is implicated in those other traumas. Hiroshima, of course, it is something that Europe is implicated in. And of course, we're very much implicated in the present construction of Israel and the ways in which Freud himself, his thesis that Moses was an Egyptian is just a wonderful way of deconstructing the kind of claims to identity that we have at the moment in Israel and Palestine. So that's the second phase. The third phase is the phase where identity recurs, if you like. So I see a strong link between the first phase, the normative phase, and the third phase, which it's again a normative bounded subject, but it takes it from exactly the opposite direction and says, but we need to look at other voices and other histories. And I think Ruth Leigh's critique of Cathy Carruth is a completely exemplary instance of this particular moment, where she says, but we're not thinking carefully enough about Clorinda in the story of Tancred and Clorinda. What about Ethiopian women, and how whose voices are we talking about here? Those questions are really important questions, but they're also questions that I'm uncomfortable with, in the sense that I guess my early training was precisely in this deconstructive psychoanalytic mode, and the ethics of that position, because that anti-identitarianism is very much where I think we need to be, along with Mbembe, who also obviously argues for that position. There's a risk if we see ourselves all as having our own traumas. Wendy Brown talks about this when she talks about injury and the ways in which people construct their identities around perceived injuries. Not only minority subjects, but you can see the enormous power of that in the US at the moment with white constructions of injury, and the ways in which this produces an identity politics where everybody has their own trauma, everybody has their own truth, and you get a kind of impasse. So that third phase, I would link back to the first phase as something that ultimately thinks about the subject in ways that are bounded, whether it's the majority subject or it's a minority subject. There's still a sense in which everybody has their own history, their own trauma, and a dislike of the kind of ethical position that's taken by the deconstructive position, which is always looking between subjects, if you like. Then I think the fourth position, the one that's emerging now, I think in different forms, takes different forms. I'll just read through the different terms that I kind of thought up. Ecological or creaturely, coming from the Frankfurt tradition that I'll be talking about in a minute. The post-human, disenclosed from the Mbembe, the planetary, or distributed subjectivity, a phrase that comes from Kajitan Iheka, an African critic. The terms that I've been using, an animist subject or a cosmological subject. These are all attempts to refigure the spatiality of the subject, to understand the subject much more as something that's distributed across various different spheres, and not as something that's as bounded as Freud presupposed, and as Descartes and all sorts of philosophers wanted to instantiate that difference between the human and the non-human, whereas the point of this fourth movement is precisely to deconstruct that opposition between the human and the non-human, and to understand the subject as dispersed across various different terrains. So consciousness is not just something inside your head, it's something that involves a whole landscape and a whole symbolic universe that might include spirits in trees, it might include spirits in the sky, it might include various different networks of being. So rather than thinking in circular terms, thinking in terms of a network, and I'll show you in a minute what I want. I'll give you some pictures for that as well. So in some ways, though, that schematization of trauma studies is a bit crude. I think, as I've suggested, I think that stage 1 and stage 3 have links, and stage 2 and stage 4 have links. But perhaps we could say that all of those stages are still grappling with one of the central problems of trauma studies, which is precisely what is inside and what is outside. How do we understand this relationship between interiority and exteriority, the relationship between an identity-based model of experience and an ethical based model, between individuation, which of course is what psychoanalysis gives us, and also of course Descartes gave us before that, and de-individuation, which can be understood as a traumatic experience, a kind of exposure to a sense of subjectlessness, but also can be a wonderfully enlarging and kind of utopic position in which we open ourselves out to the ways in which we are not one, as Judith Butler says. Grief opens us up to a sense of ourselves as never singular, but always involved in other people's lives. In fact, how can I say that I am one? Butler says in Precarious Life that grief undoes me. And that undoing, if we think trauma in some senses also undoes us, is obviously negative as an experience in many, many ways. But there is also a way in which it's positive, insofar as it teaches us the illusion of a bounded subjectivity. The fact that the idea that we can understand ourselves as singular is always an illusion that we actually need to overcome in order to understand our being in the world in a much more multiplicated way, if I can put it like that. So I'm going to redefine trauma then in what follows as the rupture, not in a singular body, but the rupture of a sense of being in common, the severance of a subject from the world and the severance of the systems that make us into beings in the first place. There's these slides, I'm sure I just thought I would include them at the moment, just to show how my own work shifted in a sense from the second position to the fourth position in my schema, that I start off working very much within a deconstructive psychoanalytic paradigm, with work particularly on Coetzee. And then I've always had this other interest in the Frankfurt School in Walter Benjamin and Theodor Adorno. And that's where, with the Creechley Mimesis paper on Chris Abani, I start thinking about a different constitution of the subject, in which the subject is not only the human person in his body or her body, but also what we usually call nature or the environment, the non-human, is actually also part of us. So in Chris Abani's Song for Night, his soul is swallowed by a dolphin and is looked after for safekeeping during the time when he's a child soldier. And that interests me as a kind of alternative spatialization of the subject, that you can be, the subject is not simply interior, it's also something that is held within a landscape, within a cultural system. And that, in fact, that's the key to understanding how he can survive his own alienation through the war, is precisely by understanding that he is not simply himself, he is also nature, if we like to call it nature. Of course, nature is only a term that's constituted by just defining it in opposition to culture. And that's precisely what my paper's working against. We've already mentioned the cosmological trauma paper, which I think I published in the wrong book. Ryan and I were long looking for an opportunity. I got this invite to publish there, but I think it was the wrong book. You tend to think of those companions as summarizing positions that have already been, whereas our paper was very much articulating a new position, which is perhaps why Steph forgot about it when he was doing his version of Tancred and Clorinda, which I actually sent to him as well. So it's kind of strange. And then just the latest turn that I've been taking, I've been trying to think together two fields: animism, the new animist return to animism in contemporary anthropology, that thinks about ecology and tries to find from indigenous cultures new ways of interacting with one's environment that are kind of alternatives to the ways in which capitalism and globalization would have us interact with the world. So that's where I'm at. So I'm going to move on. As I said, all of that work really is written against identity and against identitarianism, and thinking through an intersubjective understanding of trauma. There is a term that's been very useful for me. Harry Garuba in 2003 coined the term animist materialism. So he's bringing together there animism and historical materialism. But his understanding of historical materialism, he doesn't go into that much. And what I show in a couple of my papers is, in fact, that there is already a theory of animism within Marxism, that the historical materialist position already has a theory of the world as animated and a theory of capitalism as de-animating that world. So we talk about this term, the reanimation of the world, and that's something that Marxism is absolutely committed to. So in Garuba's essay, he suggests that Marxism is a kind of atheism, which I think most of us kind of fall into that trap. It's not an atheism. Marxism actually has an investment in life, an investment in spirited life. As you can see from this quotation from the Dialectic of Enlightenment, animism had endowed things with souls. Industrialism makes souls into things. So that dialectic, where we start off, and obviously there's a problem with their rather monotemporal Eurocentric understanding of history. We start off in early history with an animistic relation to the world, and that's displaced by an industrial, or in fact a rational environment in which those things that we understood to be enchanted, to be full of life, to be ensouled, progressively become objectified and become disposable. So the project of Marxism has to be a reaffirmation of life, a reaffirmation of the ways in which all life is animate. All life, in some sense, has spirit or soul or breath. Anima is a term that means ultimately breath, life, but it also can mean, within the new animist kind of terminologies, personhood. There's a wonderful novel by Zakes Mdar called The Sculptors of Mapungubwe, where the character goes that all, I can butcher the quotation now, all animals are people, which ruptures our sense of the person as simply a human category. And that's really the force of animist thought for me, this idea of the personhood of the non-human. But let's see, what do these fields, which ostensibly aren't really to do with trauma, have to offer trauma studies? So I would suggest that new animism complicates the question of who or what can be traumatized and how. And I'll show a few examples later on of how we can understand non-human subjects as traumatized. It overturns Freud's spatial immunitary model of the subject, and I'll go through that in a second. And it replaces it with a relational, distributed subject that's not something captured within a circle that needs to then be defended in those terms at all. Historical materialism, more complicated, and I'm being not very trendy here. Most people like new materialism, which I find annoying because of the ways in which it usually effaces indigenous positions. It kind of says the same thing, but without recognizing that this is what indigenous cultures have thought for an awfully long time. Although, Jane Bennett are kind of addressing that lacuna for a moment in the contemporary moment now. One of the things that they do, I think, which is useful, so Dominic LeCapra has this distinction between structural trauma and historical trauma. He tries to make that distinction, but it never quite works, because we realize, in fact, that those two definitions of trauma always move into one another, just as when, say, for instance, somebody undergoes a personal trauma that's entirely contingent on their life, it can also trigger structural traumas. It's questions of being, questions of the self that are not only personal to that person, but are also kind of common to everybody's construction of themselves. And there's a way in which the historical materialist approach in the Frankfurt School is helpful in that it produces, if you like, a kind of meta-historical model of trauma, in which the founding trauma is the distinction between the human and the non-human, the production of a human subject that has cut itself off from nature. Obviously, this is a sweeping grand narrative, if you like, but I find it's a very useful tool to think through. Obviously, they make the mistake of thinking that animist cultures are now extirpated, that they've been supplanted entirely by modernity, although their dialectical kind of mode means that they also think about modernity and the ways in which modernity too is animistic without knowing it. But I find it's a very useful model, not least because it speaks to the ways in which the recovery from trauma has to be, in some sense, about this recovery of a relation to that which is outside you. So there has to be, I mean, Wordsworth knew this very well, that the recovery from trauma has to be not about resecuring the self, but about relocating the self in its environment. Environment, again, in inverted commas, because environment is another term that we use to distinguish the self from something else. But to relocate or redistribute the self as something that's not simply located within the individual subject. So I just read the second last point. Together, these two fields, animism and historical materialism, suggest a new direction for trauma studies, orientated not towards the repair of the sovereign, bordered human subject, but towards towards cosmological reparation, the restoration of the ties that bind us to each other, and an embrace of our planetary implication. So I think that seems to me the utopian goal for trauma studies, that it's not about the restoration of individual subjects' integrity or in coherence. It's about recovering the fabrics of the universe, if you like, the fabrics that tie us together as beings who are implicated in one another's lives. So in that sense, you can see I use that term implication, taken from Kathy Carruth and extended via Michael Rothberg. And I think all one has to do is just step beyond the kind of human coordinates of Kathy Carruth's work and think about, okay, how are we implicated in other lives that aren't human as well, other traumas that are not necessarily human. I think you could probably excavate that in Kathy Carruth's work, but it's very much not explicit. But I think in our present moment, that becomes the task. Just to say a little bit about new animism. So new animism is a field primarily anthropological that seeks to learn from indigenous cultures alternative modes of relation to those inculcated by capitalist modernity through a radical expansion or multiplication of subjectivity. So this is its complete difference from new materialism. New materialism seeks to bracket the question of the subject completely, whereas new animism multiplies subjects. It suggests that a tree might be a subject, an iceberg might be a subject, a river might have rights and a history and a consciousness. Graham Harvey, who's kind of collated this field and dubbed it the new animism, says the new animism refers to ways of living that assume the world as a community of living persons, all deserving respect, and therefore to ways of inculcating good relations between persons of different species. There's that kind of head kind of wrangling thing where persons of different species. Okay, so for him, it's an ethics of respect. I like that formulation, but at the same time, I'm wary that that becomes a kind of form of multiculturalism that is really quite liberal. And if we just respect other people, other cultures, I'm not sure that actually does what we need to do. There has to be something more than respect. There has to be an entering into one another's perspectives, which is where mimesis for me becomes a key term. This idea that we actually need to what I call the mimetic imperative, is we need to enter into other lives, something that Gayatri Spivak announces in her book on aesthetics in an age of globalization, aesthetic education. That compulsion we take from the Romantics in some ways to enter into other lives, something that's impossible, but at the same time absolutely necessary. We can't see things from the perspective of a tree, but we need to try. Okay. So if we grant personhood to non-human beings, what goes on? Either we can say, and Steph sort of made a gesture towards this, that non-human beings can be traumatized, that the tree that Tancred slashes is traumatized, is wounded as a tree. I think that's one way of understanding how one might extend trauma studies beyond the human. But for me, that contains an element still of identitarianism. The tree is still a tree that gets wounded. Whereas for me, it's not the tree. It's not only the tree. It's the network that links Tancred to the tree that's wounded. And I'll come to that in a minute, that it's actually what he's doing there is disavowing his own relationship to nature. And I'll come into that in a minute when I get onto the Tancred and Clorinda episode. So for me, the task is not simply to extend trauma studies to another set of subjects that hasn't been looked at, but to actually completely overturn the model of the subject that we've assumed in the first place, and to overhaul the kind of normative Freudian concept of the traumatized subject who's been insulated from the outside world, but then has something that gets through that insulation. So for us, cosmological trauma redefines trauma as the disruption of a network of relations rather than the breaching of a subject's defense mechanisms. So here we have Freud's model in Beyond the Pleasure Principle. He goes back to the vesicle, this tiny little organism, and which we can think of as a circle. And he says, we have more to say of the living vesicle with its receptive cortical layer. I love reading Freud because it's just got a wonderful voice. This little fragment of living substance is suspended in the middle of an external world charged with the most powerful energies, and it would be killed by the stimulation emanating from these if it were not provided with a protective shield against stimuli. Protection against stimuli is an almost more important function for the living organism than reception of stimuli. So Freud, going down this kind of alleyway as he's thinking these thoughts, has come up with this really awful idea, really, that in order to live, we have to block out the world. That it's a more important function of living is to protect ourselves than to engage with the world. And I totally understand the logic of where he's coming from, but it's also a very alarming proposition that that's what the subject is. In some ways, what he's doing there is drawing the boundaries of that kind of bourgeois subject that Michaela was talking about before, the subject that would like to remain in sort of splendid isolation from the world. So in complete contrast to this, here's a new animist reading of subjectivity. And it's Tim's pictures that I put on the right-hand side. And he draws a circle and says, okay, that's how we normally think of being, as a self that's bounded. And then he draws the squiggly line as an alternative way of thinking about subjecthood as a movement in time, again, to echo Michaela's paper, a movement in time where we travel in a direction and that we change as we go. So we're never one thing, we're always becoming something else. And then he says, actually, we're not just that, we're becoming lots of different things at the same time. So we go off in all these different directions. So we might like to think of subjectivity as this got a squiggly, rhizomatic image of the subject. And of course, Tim Ingold is influenced by Deleuze and Guattari there. So I'll just read the last line of that. This texture is what I mean when I speak of organisms being constituted within a relational field. It's a field not of interconnected points, but of interwoven lines, not a network, but a meshwork. That's his preferred term. So if we think about that different idea of the subject in relationship to the Tancred and Clorinda episode. So you remember that, so Tancred kills Clorinda, and then he's going through an enchanted forest. He hacks at a tree, and the tree speaks to him in Clorinda's voice, and he's traumatized. This is what Freud feels, by the idea that he's continually, in a kind of repetition compulsion, always killing his beloved. So Carruth reads this in ethical terms as the address of the other, as trauma, allowing us to hear this voice that otherwise we wouldn't hear, which is, I think, very close to Coetzee's work, which very much does that kind of work, where it allows other voices to be heard, but at the same time recognizing that those other voices can't be heard as they would do in a realist novel. They can only kind of creep in through the margins. You need to counterfocalize, to use Spivak's expression, in order to hear those other voices. In Ruth Leigh's formulation, she says, well, hang on, this whole idea that it's all about Tancred and his trauma occludes the position of Clorinda, who's this Ethiopian princess who deserves a kind of her time in the light. She deserves her voice to be heard. So she accuses Carruth of a kind of occlusion of African subjectivities, and that she's engaged in a kind of identity politics that says, "Oh, you've forgotten about this subject," and for me, that's a problematic position, because it's a position that, if you look at the text itself, we need to understand what the literary text, Tasso's text, is doing there, whose voices are foregrounded and whose are not. You can't expect a literary text to have a kind of horizontal plane, as if all the voices could speak equally. We know this obviously from Can the Subaltern Speak? So Michael Rothberg comes along and says that Leys actually confuses the category of victimhood and the category of trauma. That Clorinda is a victim, she's not traumatized, she's dead. And in fact, he said this when Steph, who I know an awful lot to, invited us all to Brussels for a month or two, and this was 10 years ago. And Michael was saying is precisely this. He objected to Leys' reading because Clorinda is dead, she's not traumatized. And my response was, but the dead can be traumatized. It's only from the perspective of rationalism that we understand the dead to be non-beings. If we've read Hamlet, if we've read anything, we'll know that the dead can be traumatized, that they come back to us. And we could read that simply in terms of our traumatization. But an animist suggestion would be, actually, no, there is also a trauma in the fabric of that world that's been ruptured, and that is what's being articulated by the tree's voice, the voice of the tree, that is also, of course, Clorinda's voice, but it's also the voice of a network of beings. It's a voice that, well, let me read just the passage I have from Cosmological Trauma. What if Leys is misguided in her conflation of trauma and morality, political justice and stably bordered identities, but correct, perhaps unwittingly so, in her claim that dead people could be traumatized? What is repeated is not only Tancred's initial wounding of Clorinda, but monotheism's attempted extirpation of animism. You remember the title of this Jerusalem recovered, or Jerusalem, what's the expression? I'll come to it in a second. But it's about the First Crusades. It's about the ways in which Christianity is taking this space over, and taking over a space. The other here is figured as Muslim, but also as animist. It's an enchanted forest. It is literally the extirpation of animism that is being figured in this slashing of the tree. But the tree speaks back. In other words, we're in a text that, even though it's on the side of the Crusades, also cannot help voicing this other voice, this voice of the culture that's being erased, this voice that doesn't ever go away, because this animated culture is not fully extirpated. Just to carry on my passage, it says, in voicing its own wounding, the spirited tree thus testifies both to its own animacy and to the ties that bind Tancred, not just to Clorinda, but to all life forms. So tree hacking is a form of suicide, if you like. It's a form of ecocide that redounds upon the self, because to hack the tree down is to cut off our own breath, if you think in ecological terms. If trauma studies is not yet post-colonial, it's because its secular anthropocentric coordinates cannot conceive of trauma as a spiritual, environmental, and cosmological rupture, as something that happens and keeps on happening, not simply to individuals, nor even to people, but to the broader network of relations by which life itself is animated. So the tree speaks of the violence that the rational subject does to itself. This is Adorno and Horkheimer's point in the dialect of enlightenment. If we cut ourselves off from nature, if we understand the human as transcendent over the natural world, then what happens to human nature? We too actually are part of nature. We have bodies, and therefore, if we understand ourselves as transcending nature, we do violence to ourselves as bodies, as living organisms. So I think that's what you can read also in this passage. The voice of the tree speaks of the violence that the rational subject does to itself. It reminds Tancred and the reader of the personhood, if you like, of other life forms, or more precisely, of humanity's implication in more than human meshworks of being. So that was the title I was trying to remember. Jerusalem liberated or delivered, depending on how you translate it, is an account of the First Crusades. So it's literally an account of this historical shift, this world historical shift, if you think in Hegelian terms, from an animistic world to a monotheistic world to a rational world. And we need to read that against the grain in order to recover that animistic world in which we are once again connected back, if you like, to nature in inverted commas. So this line from the dialect of enlightenment is useful, and I always seem to quote it. The disenchantment of the world means the extirpation of animism. So disenchantment is the rational subject's refusal of magic, refusal of spirit, refusal of soul, ultimately, for anything other than the human. And that disenchantment has material effects. It destroys indigenous cultures. It is literally the extirpation of animism in that sense. But because they're working dialectically, they're suggesting this extirpation of animism will return in some form. So animism will return, and their idea is that the animism returns not least in the artwork, that the artwork is the place at which we're able to reconnect with the external world. The re-enchantment of the world is dependent on that reconnection that we get through aesthetic experience. That animistic world that they posit as a kind of beginning to human civilization is described as animistic or shamanistic, but it's also described as a mimetic world. Now, when Adorno and Horkheimer use the term mimesis, and Benjamin uses the term, they don't mean mimesis as we usually mean it through the Platonic tradition, where it's translated as representation. So mimetic work of art as a realistic work of art. That's not what they mean at all. In fact, that whole tradition of understanding art as a representation of the world is part of the problem. If we understand art as a representation of the world, you have then a representing subject, the artist, and a represented object. And you already have that subject-object split, which historical materialism wants to overcome. So what they do is they activate an older meaning of mimesis that comes from before Plato, from Dionysian rituals, in which mimesis meant an identification between subjects. So Freud picks up this term when he talks about mimetic identification. This idea then is that the work of art is not important because of how accurately it represents some exterior object, the world, history, whatever. The work of art is important because it performs this work of reconnection. It allows us to feel the world through our body. So there's that tradition, and we can talk about that later, that as this alternative understanding of mimesis, which is key to the historical materialist movement. And it's actually a complete reversal of the traditional Marxist idea that realism is better because it represents the world more accurately, which in fact, I suggest is related to Platonism and to the idea of art as a representation of reality, which is a rationalization of what art is. And there's a wonderful book by Matthew Potolsky that says, actually, that's a peculiarity of the West. Only the West really thinks that that's the primary function of art, to represent reality in this kind of photographic way. Most other cultures understand art as intertwined with ritual and with a kind of broader understanding of aesthetic experience, both in life and in art. Am I doing time-wise? Probably not very well. All my clocks have disappeared. I don't know why. Okay, when am I finishing up? 12:20.
So you can take like 5 more minutes, maybe
Okay.
3-4 minutes.
Okay, so
and
I'll just run through a couple of texts that we looked at apart from the Tancred and Clorinda. So Iwiela's Beasts of No Nation in 2005. I read, he's someone who gets alienated by his experience as a child soldier, and he's alienated from, not from nature, but from what I would call a nature culture. His own culture is embedded in nature. He understands his own possibility of moving through time, his own possibility of maturation, as linked to a particular manhood ritual in which they dance the dance of the leopard and the ox. So the animal is not understood as non-cultural. The animal too has a culture, and nature and culture are embedded in one another. As a child soldier, he engages in violence, but not in this ritualized sense of the ox and leopard dance. And therefore he cannot progress through time. He cannot become an adult. And he says this explicitly. At the end of the novel, he leaves the platoon. Many of you might have seen this as a film. And there's a rehabilitation takes place through Christian forms and also through psychoanalytic forms. And he rejects both of those ideas of how he might be rehabilitated. He's not interested in recovering himself as that bounded human subject. But what he is interested in is really fascinating. Let's read the passage. And he tells his counselor, and I'm wanting to stay in this same place forever, never moving for anything, just waiting until the dust is piling on me and grasses is covering me. An insect is making their home in the space between my teeth. I am telling her that one Iroko tree will be growing from my body, so wide that its trunk is separating day and night, and so tall that its top is tickling the moon until the man there is smiling. So from a psychoanalytic point of view, you might say, aha, melancholia. He wants to die. He just wants to go back to the earth. This is something that we should encourage him not to do. But actually, from an animist point of view, what he's doing is reconstructing a moral order. The Iroko tree is an ancestral tree. And as he puts it, it's the tree that separates night from day. It's the tree that will recover temporality for him and the difference between right and wrong. So in becoming that tree, he's suturing a ruptured cosmological order. He's been hacking at bodies all through the novel, but now he wants an end to hacking. He wants to recover the tree as a cosmological marker, as something that will give his life back symbolic meaning. And finally, in Sleepwalking Land, that I was going to talk about, whose memory is it anyway, comes from thinking about the peculiar dilemmas of this novel that understands the land itself as traumatized. Through the title, we can see that the land itself is somnambulistic. It has been traumatized by the 20-year post-independence war in Mozambique. And the novel starts, war had killed the road thereabouts. And what the novel tries to do is think, how can this landscape be re-enchanted? How can we move from this deathscape into a lifescape? And what it does is it parallels two narratives. One of Tuahir, of Kinzu, who's been made an orphan. He's traveled right through the Civil War and become a Naparama, a mystical being that kind of will bring an end to war. And at the same time, it's that narrative is actually written in notebooks that the characters in the other narrative pick up. They find his dead body, the guy's been killed, but they find on his person a suitcase that contains multiple exercise books in which he's written his memoir of the war. So very much like Michaela, writing becomes a way of exiting a traumatic state to a certain extent, but not only writing, but precisely reading. Or not only reading, but reading aloud, because reading aloud is that which recovers the sense of literature as a bodily experience. And I've worked with refugees where we've read aloud text, and it's very powerful to read aloud together something. It does something very different to the kind of traditional reading group where you read a text in isolation and then you come and discuss it. So reading aloud is something that really interests me. And essentially the road becomes reanimated through the reading. The road is bathed in light, in the moonlight, as Mudinga reads. But what's just very interesting in final moments here is the idea that Mudinga, he's had his memory wiped. The guy who finds him in a pile of corpses decides that his experience has been so traumatic that he gets a witch doctor to wipe his memory for him. He thinks that's the only way he can actually move on. But the novel then gives him a kind of surrogate memory. It gives him the memory of Kinzu through the notebooks. And Tuahir, the father, suggests in this quotation here, Tuahir had understood Kinzu's notebooks had given Muad'Dingo a borrowed memory of those impossible days. So it raises a very scandalous question for psychoanalysis. Can one take on somebody else's memory as one's own? And that kind of despatialization of memory is partly what I thought I was going to talk about, but I had to get through all the other stuff first. Sorry about that. But that seems to me a kind of provocation for us to think about how it's actually in the sharing of memory that we become subjects, rather than in the kind of accumulation of memory, to go back to the idea of enclosure. It's not about recovering a biography that we might move forwards, but it's about exchanging. And that's precisely how Kutu defines re-enchantment. He says that re-enchantment for him is about when he was a child, he was being read to by his parents. He says literature offers us a chance to migrate from ourselves, a chance to become others inside ourselves, a chance to re-enchant the world. Literature is not only a way to affirm our existence, which I take it is the kind of identity politics move, it's also permission to disappear and to allow the presence of those who seem to be absent. I'll leave it at that. I've got one little slide that I can leave you with, but the last page of the novel is wonderful because the notebook is dropped, and what happens is it's blown by a wind born not from air but from the ground itself, and the sheets scatter along the road, and then one by one the letters turn into grains of sand, and little by little all this is Kinzu's writings, are transformed into pages of earth. I'll leave you at that. With that.
Thank you so much, sir, for that riveting talk. And it has indeed opened up avenues of thought for us. You have quite promisingly, in fact, pondered upon several interesting topics, something, in fact, which is different from all that we have been seeing or hearing regarding trauma and memory studies. You have talked about cosmological trauma, immunitary versus enmeshed subjects, and you have also discussed Trancade and Clorinda and the true spirits, trauma, disenchantment, and memory, etc. Now, sir, one particular point that I would like to bring up is that in the recent trends in memory studies or trauma studies, not exactly a trend, but
I've lost your voice.
You've got muted.
Okay, you're better now. I can hear you now, I think.
Sorry, sir. Am I audible?
No, I got most of the question. Yeah.
Yeah.
We got to the point about trend.
Yeah, so not particularly a trend, but what our conference is trying to gather around or attend to is particularly to move away from the Western point of view of trauma studies, which focuses on the individual, right? Now moving away from that, pertaining to the global South, it is more about a collective trauma, attending to the historical legacies of such traumatic narratives that we have experienced or are experiencing, etc. Now coming to the animistic point of view, which pertains or revolves around circular memory or a networking. Now, my question, or rather I would rather want your remarks on this is, how do you see animistic memory or animistic tendencies towards trauma and memory studies pertaining to the narrators of the global South? Do you think this adds to the question or the practice of decolonizing trauma and memory studies? Like, how do you read that, or how do you see this coming up in the recent trends or studies? Yeah.
Great, that's a fantastic question for Hannah. Yeah. So I think I would want to question these categories of the West or the global North and the global South, because obviously indigenous thought is not, it ruptures that sense that the global South can speak back to the West. I think the idea of disenclosure is really important because it suggests that the problem is not necessarily the West, but property, the enclosure of land, the hierarchization of life, hierarchizations of animism. The hierarchizations of animacy that suggests that some lives are more important than others. Yeah. So that would be my first move, to deconstruct this opposition between the global north and the global south, which I think is already there within Caruth. She's already trying to move beyond Europe. And I just don't, I love the, theory from the Global South book that the Interconference is premised on, but they're also, Jean and John Komaroff are very much interested in indigenous cultures and how animistic cultures, I mean, let's not romanticize them. There's a very interesting article by an Indian anthropologist that gets fed up with the romanticization of animist cultures and said, well, actually animism in India can lead to hierarchies and domination just in the same way as capitalism can. And I think that's a very useful point to bear in mind. So I'm not wanting to simply romanticize animist cultures. I didn't have time to kind of nuance that in my talk, but that's important to say. But yes, I would say that we need to be careful about making a grand opposition between the global north and the global south. I'd love to hear what you guys have to say about identity in India, and Modi and what's going on there. I'm very aware that, it doesn't just stop in the West, this idea of identity and the idea of a kind of essentialized subject. So that would be where I would go. I mean, I think, yeah, it's really important to have lots of different ideas of trauma from different experiences. But the problem with that kind of multicultural model is that you just have a proliferation of people saying, I'm injured, I'm injured, I'm injured. And sometimes that can feed into a sort of, well, you can see what it did in the States, right? It then whites became injured all of a sudden, right? So it's a problem, and Wendy Brown's absolutely right there. I don't know if that completely answers your question, Farhana. But if there's part that I haven't answered, do say.
No, sir, that's absolutely fine. And we are really, really grateful for you agreeing to be a part of this conference. I'm sure we have a few questions from the audience, so I'll pass on to Sana to take up a few questions. Over to you, Sana.
Thank you, Farhana. Thank you, Professor Durrant, for that amazing and enriching talk. We're blessed to have you here. And I have so many comments, but I'll particularly just give you one comment that, the last part of your presentation where you talked about the story telling as the reenactment and the, existence of that notebook in the novel, that reminded me of one of the famous movies that came out in 2004, Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. And it's definitely, I could draw parallels between the two. And you've given a newer lens to look at, for all of us to look at those movies come out pertaining to a memory. But we do have some questions from the audience, if you could, answer those really quickly. A question says, thank you, Professor Durrant. You suggest that the illusion of a bounded subjectivity needs to be reworked on and suggest a sort of a post-identity intersubjectivity. How do you look at this proposition in relation to omnicide, as Professor Steph Crabb suggests, with respect to the destruction of ecology or the earth?
Okay, yes, so I think there was a connection between my paper and Steph's there in terms of omnicide. I tend to use, exactly that. I've looked at the relationship between ecocide and genocide in two different texts. One is a film called Dead Man, which I don't know if anybody's seen. It's a Jim Jarmusch film that wants to think about the romantic investment, the romantic poet's investment in a critique of industrialization and the ways in which that becomes a destruction of life. And it also wants to think that alongside the Native American experience of being genocided, if you like. And it puts them together through a very hilarious conceit that Johnny Depp is an accountant traveling west to a town called Machine. And he's called William Blake, but he hasn't read any William Blake's poetry. But then he meets a Native American who has read William Blake's poetry and recognizes in the person of Johnny Depp, William Blake. And he says, I love your poetry. And Johnny Depp says, I don't know any poetry. I hate poetry. But what the film tries to do is produce an interface between those two traditions of the romantic poetry and the Native American understanding of what's going on at the frontier, and producing a kind of common understanding so we can relate ecocide and genocide to get together. I haven't used the term omnicide. It's quite a useful term. Yeah, we can go with that term if you like. The other novel the text that I've written on that relates those two together is an absolutely wonderful novel called That Dead Man Dance. That Dead Man Dance is an Australian novel by an Aboriginal writer that thinks about the destruction of the whales in Australia in the colonial period, alongside the destruction of Aboriginal life. It does so, though, through an animistic kind of narrative that continually moves in and out of different subjectivities. The Noongar relation to creativity is precisely that you only create through entering into somebody else's consciousness, and not just someone else's, but another species' consciousness. So creationists in this Noongar community involve a man going into a whale and squeezing the whale's heart, and the song that's produced by the whale is then part of aesthetic production. That's how their stories begin, through this merging of man and whale, which allows them to travel beyond their own territory, if you like, although they don't conceive of territory in quite the same way that the West does, to use the term the West. And then they would come back enriched through different experiences. So that's another text in which I think about the relationship between ecocide and genocide. It's an essay that you can see on the first slide, I think, to do with it's in a journal. It's just coming out to do on mimesis, which has been a kind of interestingly rejuvenated topic over the last few years. If I just cover the slide. So the essay is called Homo Ecologicus, Animism, Historical Materialism, and Planetary Mimesis. But the second half of the essay talks about this wonderful novel called That Dead Man Dance. I'm not sharing my screen anymore, am I? Or am I?
No, sir, you're not.
Okay, right. It doesn't matter about that. But if anybody wants them, these slides will all be available through the recording, won't they? Brilliant. I seem to have lost everybody now. Here you are. Right, brilliant. Okay. Any other questions?
There's another question, sir, from a participant. They ask, while the human may be implicated in non-human networks, would you say that the human is uniquely endowed with agency, or, to be specific, responsibility, and in that sense transcends the cosmological network it may be distributed in? If so, what role does an animist lens play in ecological activism? After all, the human, self-serving as he is, would be more compelled to save a tree to save himself rather than save one because he thinks of the tree as an entity with soul or life.
That's a fantastic question. Thank you. It'd be lovely to find out who was that question from?
It's a fellow PhD scholar, Noorus Sabah. She's here.
Okay, so you could forward me his name. That would be great. Yes, so that's a dimension that I didn't really bring up, especially with my final quotation where the notebook goes into the earth. There's a dissolution of the human that's happening there, and a dissolution of culture. But what's interesting in the dialectic of enlightenment is that they don't advocate simply a return to nature. So you have this idea from Benjamin of becoming similar as a kind of ethic, but there's also a kind of break put on that through Adorno's work, where he talks also about non-identity, that we can become similar, but we can never become identical. And that the human being, there's a wonderful quotation that I'm going to butcher here, where they say that we need to get rid of the idea of the human as transcending nature. And we need to recover the sense of the human as part of nature. But at the same time, it's only humans that have this consciousness of themselves as part of nature. And so mimesis is not simply this movement where you go into another being and dissolve your own subjectivity. It's also a kind of self-critical doubling up where you're aware. He says that we're the only species that's aware of being part of nature. And it's that awareness that then produces that ecological agency that your questioner is asking about. So yeah, absolutely, there needs to be a space for critical reflection. And that really has to be a human space. You know, we can't expect trees. There are anthropologists who argue, that forests can think, for instance, very famously, Edward Cohen's work. But I think I still have a residual humanism within me where I think we still need, if we're going to talk about politics and agency and action, we still need to produce a space in which the human reflects on its own understanding of itself as part of nature. And of course, that's where literature comes in as well. Literature isn't simply a kind of blind experience of becoming a tree or becoming whatever. It's a reflection on that experience. So there's always a doubling in process. You're not just becoming similar in a kind of non-rational sense. There's also an interesting kind of alternative form of rationality, which the Frankfurt School are after, where you're feeling your relation to the world, but you're also reflecting on it. So ultimately, for historical materialism, the goal is a kind of understanding of ourselves as part of damaged life, this wonderful term from Adorno, where we can identify with other forms of damaged life, but the identification is, in a sense, a kind of form of species consciousness, not class consciousness, or a kind of life consciousness, where we're aware that we're all in solidarity. So in the Jim Jarmusch film, there's a solidarity between the Native Americans and the bison, who are both being exterminated. But it's only the Native Americans who can have that consciousness of that as a historical phenomenon.
We have another question, Professor, and they thank you for your thought-provoking presentation and ask, I'm intrigued by the idea of re-examining the history of colonialism through your framework. Could you elaborate on the connection between animism and trauma within the context of colonial rule, shedding some light on the impact of these dynamics globally?
Okay, that's a big question. So from within the historical materialist perspective, colonialism has a very long history, that it's not simply European colonialism. I think we can talk about colonialism perhaps from the moment of settlement. And that's I think, part of the value of Achille Mbembe's work to do with disenclosure. And so I've done some work on animism in Southern Africa, and I'm trying to think back to a moment in which animism is itself not enclosed. Because if we look at most indigenous cultures are implicated in regimes of property, right? Even though they will resist, I think the idea of guardianship or custodianship of land is really powerful. But nevertheless, nearly all indigenous peoples are somehow implicated in modernity. There's no pure indigenous subject that we could locate that hasn't been affected by the history of property. But there's a very interesting novel by Zakes Mda called The Sculptors of Mapungubwe, in which he looks at 13th century African culture in around where we now think of Zimbabwe. And incidentally, the Zimbabwe itself means a kind of stone structure. So archaeologists have gone back and they can see this evidence of enclosure, of an enclosed land, where land has been demarcated, my land, and where the human exists within the walls and the non-human without, with a kind of a space between those, which is the space for domesticated animals. And what the novel tries to do is think back to that moment prior to settlement, in which what's happening is that you have a horizontal relationship where animals are people too. So one of the characters comes from a nomadic tribe related to the San and the Khoi, in which he resists settlement. He's nomadic. He gets this idea of his feet itching, Shambili, butchering that, this kind of affliction that he needs to wander. So he's resisting settlement itself. So I guess that would be my answer to that question, that we need to think the history of colonialism in a very much longer way, which it starts with settlement, with the articulation of this land as mine and not yours.
Thank you so much, sir. Maybe we can take one more question before closing this session.
Sure, it's quite early in the day for me, so I'm happy.
Do you feel that a field like eco-criticism and the blurring of the boundaries between the humans and non-humans have a significant role to play in enabling this turn towards a different animist understanding of the fields of trauma studies?
Yes, I think I would locate my work within eco-criticism, even though I didn't explicitly I did so in the sense that my fourth field was this ecological subject. So I think, yes, that I think it depends on, you can do it differently. And of course, there are problems in talking about animism, which is a colonial term produced by colonial anthropology, which understood animism to be a belief in primitive beings, sorry, a primitive belief in the spirited nature of the non-human. And new animism tries to push away that old colonial inheritance, but there is still a problem that it's largely white anthropologists going to visit indigenous cultures, and there's an impulse, which I talk about in another essay, to become animist. There's a desire on the part of the anthropologist to go native, if you like, which is obviously complicated from a post-colonial angle. So there are all sorts of liabilities to the kind of things that I'm interested in, which are kind of narratives of going native, but they're narratives that are self-conscious about this process of kind of becoming indigenous, if you like, which is a possibility that some indigenous peoples will resist, obviously, because it can produce forms of cultural appropriation. It can produce all sorts of problems in terms of racial dynamics. But that's why I'm particularly interested in this novel, that Dead Man Dance, because here is a Noongar writer inviting us into his world, and he's showing us this is what the novel is made for. The novel isn't made for partitioning experience, for articulating, affirming one's own experience. The novel is made for entering into other people's experience. And those other people might also be whales, they might be trees, they might be mountains. So he's taking that humanist inheritance of the novel and exploring how actually what the novel is really for is for traveling into other consciousnesses, not all of whom are human. So I got carried away. I don't know if that was an answer or not.
Thank you so much, sir. We have this one quick question from Professor Borzaga. She is asking you to quickly, maybe comment on Jane Bennett's work on whether Jane Bennett's work on vibrant matter is related to your idea of animism.
Okay, thank you very much, Michaela. Yes. I think that's also a question of whether there's a relationship between historical materialism and new materialism. So Jane Bennett's Vibrant Matter is the kind of text of new materialist thought. And I would suggest that there are lots of confluences, but that Jane Bennett's founding gesture is to say, I'm fed up with talking about the subject. Let's try and bracket the subject and think of the world as molecules, think of the world as all these engaging substances. And what new materialism sometimes lacks for me is a sense of the necessary politics that you need to have. So you do still need a kind of subject position. The answer can't be that we all dissolve back into the earth. The answer could be that we read a novel about dissolving back into the earth, which is different because that's implying that we have a consciousness that reads and that is able to understand this experience of entering into other lives. So yeah, I would say, I mean, the distinction between new animism and new materialism is that new animism proliferates subjects. It says that, a tree can be a subject, a jaguar can be a subject, a waterfall can be a subject, whereas Jane Bennett says, let's not talking about subjects, let's bracket the subject out. I think in her later work, she's revising that position slightly. She was involved in these discussions that we've been having with Nidesh Lawtu, and who's got a big project called Homo Mimeticus. So I've been hearing her articulating that, and also in a sense not quite apologizing, but recognizing that new materialism articulates positions that have already been articulated by many different indigenous peoples, and that's not clear in Vibrant Matter and a lot of other new materialist work, that actually the ideas that they're speaking of are very old ideas, not new ideas at all. And I guess if one thing we could take out of this conference is being suspicious of new anythings in some ways, that there's always a kind of trumping that goes on that really is annoying. And it's particularly annoying because it privileges the Western Academy as producing new movements. And I think indigenous scholars have done a good job of critiquing that kind of assumption of a kind of avant-gardeness of the Western Academy. Does that help, Michaela? I've just seen you pop up on my screen. I so enjoyed your talk, by the way. It was just wonderful. And it seems like we're barking up very similar trees. We can't hear you. We can't hear you.
Could you please unmute Professor Borzaga?
This was an excellent response to Jane Bennett's work, because I'm sure some people in the audience had also this kind of association. And I sorry I popped a little bit later into your talk, but it seems to be a kind of overlap, and or we were talking to each other from different perspectives. And I will go back to all the readings that you put. Yeah, thank you.
You've got a very shared interest in Mbembe, and I was just checking that book that I hadn't come across yet, The Politics of Time. I'd love to read that soon. I think that sounds...
Yeah, and there is another one about... well, he's been very prolific, but too prolific perhaps over the last few years. And something about, again, the climate change crisis, and something with terrestrial, So there is another one about this whole notion of the
terrestrial, the earthly
terrestrial co-living in French. It hasn't been translated into English yet. Yeah, but this book
I'm so behind because I usually read his books in English. I can read French very slowly. No, that's exactly because we both quoted from the same book, the Out of the Dark Night book, to think about the planetary. So those great confluences, and that'd be really interesting to explore those further at some point.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Durrant, for that wonderful talk, and thank you, Professor Borzaga, for tuning us and staying with us the whole day. Although you started your day quite early, I believe, and really we can't thank you enough, sir. So much, so many new things for us to think about, so many avenues opened. And I would also like to take this opportunity to thank everyone, all the people who have joined us from different time zones. And I would also like to thank the chairs of the session, Professor Simi Malhotra and Farhana Tasneem, and the repertoire for the session, Zainab Abrar, for helping us run everything so efficiently. I would now like to officially close for the second day of our conference, a successful day, I reckon. And we would reconvene tomorrow for the third and the final day of our conference titled Trauma and Memory Studies. It starts quite early, 10:30 tomorrow. So see you all there. We can stop.
Can I just say, just to say to people, if they want to look at any of my papers, I try and get most things up on academia.edu. So if anybody's interested, that's where the Cosmopolitan Trauma one, because the book probably gets lost. Nobody can afford books anymore.
Thank you so much, Professor Durrant. That was absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Really great.
Thank you for inviting me. I really enjoyed myself. And lovely to talk to you all.
Thank you. Thank you.